What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about leadership, loyalty, and what happens when power meets weakness on the world stage. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why millions of people are talking about one of the most embarrassing moments in recent political history. So let me take you inside a meeting that happened recently between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A meeting that revealed something truly disturbing about where America stands today. Picture this scene. The president of Ukraine, a man whose country has been fighting for its survival against a brutal invasion, arrives in the United States hoping for support from what should be one of his strongest allies. But instead of being greeted with the respect and dignity that a wartime leader deserves, he gets treated like an afterthought. And what happened next is something you really need to understand because it affects all of us. When Zelensky's plane landed, nobody from the Trump administration bothered to greet him at the airport, which is already a massive sign of disrespect in diplomatic terms. But it gets worse because the meeting itself didn't even happen in a proper official setting like the White House or a formal government building. Instead, Trump held this crucial meeting about war and peace in the dining room of Mar-a-Lago, his private resort in Florida. And if you think that sounds inappropriate, you're absolutely right. During this meeting, Trump kicked out the press corps and made strange comments about food, asking if Zelensky wanted to eat, and then joking about whether people would call it a bribe if he offered food, which is just bizarre behavior for such a serious occasion. But the real shock came during the press conference that followed, because what Trump said next left people around the world absolutely stunned, and you could see it on Zelensky's face, the Ukrainian president trying desperately to maintain his composure while hearing things that made no sense whatsoever. Trump stood there and told everyone that Russian President Vladimir Putin is strong and powerful, and then claimed that Putin really wants to help Ukraine, saying that during their 2.5-hour phone conversation, Putin told him about all the wonderful things Russia wants to do for Ukraine, including trading with them, giving them cheap energy, and making Ukraine rich. And if you're thinking that sounds completely insane, given that Russia has been bombing Ukrainian cities and killing Ukrainian civilians for years now, you're not alone in that thought. The cameras caught Zelensky's reaction in real time, and you could see this look on his face, a mix of disbelief and barely controlled frustration, because here he is standing next to the American president while Trump talks about how the country that invaded his homeland and killed his people actually wants to help them prosper. And Zelensky gave this odd glance and smirk that said everything without saying a word, the kind of expression that screams, "Are you serious right now?" but trying to stay diplomatic about it. Think about what Trump was actually claiming here for a moment. That Russia, the country that launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that has been firing missiles at apartment buildings and hospitals, that has been accused of war crimes and genocide, supposedly just wants Ukraine to succeed and become wealthy. And Trump said he believes Putin when Putin tells him this, which raises so many questions about judgment and reality that it's hard to know where to even begin. During the same press conference, Trump went on one of his typical tangents about the 2020 election, claiming it was rigged and stolen, even though we're now in 2026. And every legitimate investigation and court case has confirmed that he lost fair and square. But more importantly, Trump claimed that if the 2020 election hadn't been stolen, Russia never would have invaded Ukraine in the first place, which makes absolutely no sense when you look at the actual timeline and Putin's long-standing ambitions in the region. And you could see Zelensky's face again showing this expression of complete bewilderment, like, what are you even talking about? The evidence actually shows something very different from what Trump claims, because since Trump took office this time around, Putin has actually escalated his attacks on Ukraine with increased ballistic missile strikes on civilian areas and drone attacks happening at much higher rates than before. So the idea that Trump's presidency somehow deters Russian aggression doesn't match up with what's actually happening on the ground, where real people are dying every single day. When reporters asked the obvious question about whether Russia had agreed to a ceasefire, because that's supposedly what all these negotiations are supposed to achieve, Trump's answer was revealing in the worst possible way. He said, no, Russia hasn't agreed to a ceasefire. And then he went on to explain Putin's reasoning in a way that seemed like he was defending it rather than challenging it, saying that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire because if the fighting stops and then has to start again, that would be bad. And Trump said he understands that position. Let that sink in for a moment, because Ukraine has consistently said they're willing to have a ceasefire. They've been asking for a pause in the fighting so they can negotiate properly and so fewer people have to die. But Russia keeps refusing. And instead of pressuring Russia to stop killing people, Trump is out here saying he understands why Putin won't agree to stop the war, which is exactly what Putin wants to hear from an American president. Validation for continuing the violence. Trump revealed that he spoke with Putin twice that day, once before meeting with Zelensky and once after, which raises serious questions about coordination and whose side Trump is really on in this conflict, because it looks an awful lot like Trump is checking in with Putin to get his instructions before and after talking to the Ukrainian president, which is not how an ally behaves and definitely not how a superpower should conduct its foreign policy. The whole situation gets even more disturbing when you hear Trump talking about how he and Putin have been through so much together, specifically mentioning the Russia investigation that looked into Russian interference in American elections. And Trump described how Putin would call him and they would commiserate about the investigation, complaining to each other about how people were making things up. And Trump seems completely oblivious to the fact that what he's describing, having private conversations with Putin about an investigation into Russian interference, is literally the kind of collusion that people were worried about in the first place. There's video from years ago during Trump's first presidency when he went to Helsinki to meet Putin. And in that famous press conference, Trump stood next to Putin and said he trusted Putin's denial about election interference more than he trusted American intelligence agencies, his own country's intelligence services. And now, years later, Trump is still defending Putin and still having these cozy conversations with him while treating America's actual allies with contempt and disrespect. During the campaign that got Trump elected the first time, there's that infamous moment caught on video where Trump looked directly into the camera and said, "Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find those emails," basically asking a foreign adversary to hack his political opponent. And now we have Trump admitting that he talks to Putin regularly about these investigations and about how they're both victims of unfair treatment, which just confirms what many people suspected all along about the nature of that relationship. When a reporter asked Trump what his message was to the families of the more than 100 American citizens who died fighting in Ukraine, people who volunteered to help defend democracy against authoritarian aggression, Trump couldn't even manage to say thank you for your service or honor their sacrifice. Instead, he just said, it's a shame they died in a foreign country and that some of them were celebrated people, which is about the coldest and most dismissive response you could possibly give to grieving families who lost loved ones fighting for a cause they believed in. The Russian government put out their own statement about these phone calls between Trump and Putin, and their version of events is extremely revealing because, according to the Kremlin, Trump called Putin first, not the other way around, and they discussed how both leaders agree that a temporary ceasefire would actually prolong the conflict rather than help end it, which is straight up Russian propaganda that Trump appears to have adopted as his own position. The idea that stopping the killing would somehow cause more war, which is pure doublespeak right out of George Orwell's 1984, where war is peace and freedom is slavery. Russia's statement said that Trump told Putin the Ukrainian conflict was the most difficult one for him to deal with, and that Trump listened carefully to Russia's assessment of what should happen next, which again makes it sound like Trump is taking orders, or at least taking guidance from Putin, rather than standing up for American interests or for the democratic principles that America is supposed to represent on the world stage. The Russian readout also mentioned that Trump talked about impressive prospects for economic cooperation between the United States and Russia once the conflict in Ukraine ends, and they exchanged New Year's greetings and wished happiness to each other's people, which sounds lovely, except for the fact that this warm, fuzzy relationship is happening while Russia continues to bomb Ukrainian cities and kill Ukrainian civilians, with Trump apparently okay with all of it as long as he can eventually do business deals with Russia. To understand just how weak and pathetic this looks, it helps to compare Trump's meeting with Zelensky to how other world leaders have handled the same situation. And the contrast is absolutely stark and embarrassing for America. When Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Zelensky, he welcomed him with respect and dignity, talked about standing with Ukraine during this difficult time, discussed the importance of supporting Ukrainian democracy and sovereignty, and announced $2.5 billion in economic assistance to help Ukraine defend itself and eventually rebuild, showing what actual leadership and actual alliance looks like. Carney talked about creating conditions for a just and lasting peace, emphasized that this requires Russia to be willing to negotiate in good faith, and condemned the barbaric attacks on Ukrainian civilians, including a major attack on Kiev that had happened just that night, showing that he understands who the aggressor is and who the victim is in this situation. And he spoke about helping unlock additional financing from international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to support Ukraine's economy and reconstruction. The difference between how Carney treated Zelensky and how Trump treated him is like night and day. It's the difference between a leader who understands moral clarity and stands up for democratic values versus someone who seems more interested in pleasing an authoritarian dictator than in supporting a democracy under attack. And people around the world are noticing this difference and drawing conclusions about what America has become under Trump's leadership. What we're witnessing here is a fundamental realignment of global relationships where the United States under Trump is no longer functioning as the leader of the free world or as a reliable ally to democracies. Instead, America is cozying up to Russia while Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, and other democratic nations form what some are calling a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine without American leadership, which is a dramatic shift in how global power and influence work. Throughout this entire mess, Zelensky has had to maintain his composure and his dignity while being disrespected and while hearing his country's enemy being praised by someone who should be his ally. And you have to give him credit for not losing his cool, even though you could see on his face multiple times that he was thinking about how absurd and insulting the whole situation was, trying to stay diplomatic while Trump said things that any rational person would recognize as delusional or dishonest. The core issue here goes way beyond just one awkward meeting or one disrespectful press conference, because what we're seeing is a pattern where Trump consistently sides with Putin over democratic allies, consistently believes Putin's claims over the assessments of American and allied intelligence agencies, and consistently acts in ways that benefit Russian interests, even when those interests directly harm American strategic goals and values, which raises fundamental questions about loyalty, judgment, and fitness for leadership. When Trump says he understands why Putin doesn't want a ceasefire, when he says Putin really wants to help Ukraine prosper, when he talks about how strong and powerful Putin is, when he describes their friendly phone conversations and their shared grievances, he's not just making diplomatic small talk, he's revealing whose side he's really on in a conflict that will shape the future of democracy versus authoritarianism for decades to come. And right now it looks very much like Trump is on Putin's side rather than on the side of freedom and democracy. The propaganda talking points that Trump repeated during this press conference, things like Ukraine should just give up territory because Russia is supposedly making rapid advances on the front lines, or that a ceasefire would actually cause more war rather than less. These aren't Trump's original ideas. These are Russian propaganda narratives that the Kremlin has been pushing for months. And the fact that an American president is repeating them word for word should alarm everyone, regardless of their political views, because it shows either that Trump is being manipulated or that he's willingly acting as a spokesperson for Russian interests. Russian officials have been very clear about their actual goals if you listen to what they say rather than what Trump claims they say. They talk about Ukraine being a fake country that needs to be wiped off the map. They describe their invasion as a special operation that needs to fully succeed, meaning complete conquest. They say Ukraine needs to be eliminated as an independent nation. And there's zero indication in anything Russian leaders actually say that they want peace or that they want Ukraine to prosper. But Trump either doesn't know this or doesn't care, and instead just accepts whatever Putin tells him in their private conversations. The experts who study this conflict, including military analysts and organizations like the Institute for the Study of War, point out that Russia's claims about rapid territorial gains are largely false propaganda, and that for Russia to actually conquer the parts of eastern Ukraine they're demanding that Ukraine just hand over would require years more fighting and likely more than 1 million additional Russian military casualties, which is why Putin wants those territories given to him through negotiations rather than having to fight for them. And then once Russia controls those areas, they would use them as a launching point for further attacks deeper into Ukraine toward the capital of Kyiv. What's happening right now is that Ukraine is willing to consider difficult compromises, including potentially holding a referendum about the status of certain territories, but only if there's a real ceasefire first, a 60 to 90-day pause in the fighting, so negotiations can happen without people dying every single day, which is a completely reasonable position that any honest broker would support. But Russia refuses because they know that once the fighting stops, their leverage decreases and the world can see more clearly who the aggressor is and who the victim is. Trump's threat to Zelensky during the press conference, saying that Ukraine better make a deal now because more land might be taken in the coming months, is exactly the kind of pressure that benefits Russia and harms Ukraine, because it's basically telling Ukraine to surrender territory or else face the consequences, which removes any incentive for Russia to negotiate in good faith, since they know the American president is going to pressure Ukraine to give up rather than pressure Russia to stop attacking. The weakness and pathetic nature of Trump's position becomes even more clear when you remember his own history with Russia, the way he asked Russia to find Hillary Clinton's emails during the 2016 campaign, the way he consistently defended Putin and attacked American intelligence agencies, the way he had private meetings with Putin where he wouldn't allow American note takers or translators to keep records of what was discussed, the way he tried to withhold military aid from Ukraine during his first presidency unless Zelensky agreed to investigate his political rivals, and now this latest episode where he's essentially acting as Putin's representative in negotiations that are supposed to be about helping Ukraine. Some people watching all this might wonder if they're being too harsh on Trump, or if maybe there's some strategic genius behind his approach that we're not seeing, some kind of advanced diplomatic chess game where he's actually playing Putin to get a better deal for Ukraine. But the evidence really doesn't support that interpretation when you look at the actual results. Russia is escalating its attacks. Ukraine is being pressured to surrender territory. American alliances are fracturing, and Putin is getting everything he wants, including an American president who validates his talking points and understands his position while showing contempt for the democratic leader whose country is being invaded. The historical parallel here is uncomfortable but important to recognize. We're watching in real time as an American president abandons allies and appeases an aggressive authoritarian power. And we've seen this movie before in the 1930s when democratic nations tried to appease Hitler by letting him take territory in the hopes that it would satisfy his ambitions and prevent a larger war. And we know how that turned out. Appeasement doesn't work with authoritarian expansionists. It just encourages them to take more because they learn that aggression pays off without serious consequences. For young people watching this unfold, people who maybe don't remember the Cold War or don't have a deep background in international relations, it's important to understand that what we're seeing is not normal and it's not okay. America became a superpower and maintained that position for decades by standing up for democratic values, by supporting allies, by deterring aggression from authoritarian regimes, and by showing that freedom and democracy are worth defending even when it's difficult or expensive. But right now, under Trump's leadership, America is abandoning that role, and it's hard to overstate how significant and dangerous that shift really is. The people of Ukraine who have been fighting and dying for their freedom for years now, who have shown incredible courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming military force. who have managed to stop Russia's initial attempt to conquer their entire country and have been slowly pushing Russian forces back in some areas. These people are watching an American president praise their enemy and pressure them to surrender, and they must feel betrayed and abandoned by a country that they thought would stand with them against tyranny and aggression. Zelensky himself has become a symbol of democratic resistance, a leader who stayed in his capital when Russia invaded, even though he could have fled to safety, who has rallied his people and the world to support Ukraine's fight for survival, who has shown what real leadership looks like under pressure, and to see him standing next to Trump having to listen to praise for Putin and suggestions that Ukraine should just give up territory must be one of the most difficult and degrading experiences of his presidency, yet he handled it with grace and dignity that Trump could never match. The broader implications of Trump's approach to this conflict extend far beyond Ukraine itself, because every other country in the world is watching and learning lessons about whether they can count on America as an ally, whether American security commitments mean anything, whether democracy has a powerful defender, or whether democratic nations are on their own against authoritarian aggression. And the lesson that Trump is teaching right now is that America cannot be trusted, that if you're a democracy facing an authoritarian threat, you better not count on American support, because that support can disappear as soon as someone like Trump takes power. This matters for Taiwan, which faces threats from China. It matters for the Baltic states, which worry about Russian expansion. It matters for South Korea, which relies on American security guarantees against North Korea. It matters for democracies everywhere that have based their security planning on the assumption that America would stand with them. And now that assumption is being called into question in a fundamental way that will reshape global security calculations for years to come. The economic dimension of what Trump described also reveals his priorities. He talked enthusiastically about the prospects for doing business with Russia once the conflict ends, about trade deals and economic cooperation, which shows that he's thinking about personal and corporate profit rather than about principles or values or the lives of people being killed by Russian missiles. And this tracks with his entire approach to foreign policy, where everything seems to be transactional and everything seems to come back to deals and money rather than to moral leadership or strategic thinking. When you put all these pieces together, the disrespectful treatment of Zelensky, the praise for Putin, the adoption of Russian propaganda talking points, the pressure on Ukraine to surrender, the private conversations with Putin coordinating positions, the enthusiasm about future business deals with Russia, the understanding of Putin's reasons for refusing a ceasefire, it paints a picture that's hard to interpret in any way other than Trump being more aligned with Russia than with Ukraine and with democracy, whether that's because he's being manipulated, because he's compromised in some way, because he genuinely admires authoritarian strongmen, or because he sees profit opportunities. The end result is the same, and it's deeply disturbing. For anyone who cares about democracy, who believes that free societies should support each other against authoritarian aggression, who thinks that America should stand for something more than just deals and transactions, this moment should be a wake-up call about what's at stake and about how much damage can be done when weak and unprincipled leadership takes over from principled leadership. And the contrast with how other democratic leaders like Prime Minister Carney are handling the same situation just makes Trump's approach look even worse by comparison. The saddest part of this whole situation might be those American citizens who died fighting in Ukraine, volunteers who believed in the cause of defending democracy strongly enough that they were willing to risk and ultimately give their lives for it. And their families had to hear the American president dismiss their sacrifice as just a shame that they died in a foreign country, not honoring them, not thanking them, not acknowledging the nobility of what they were fighting for, just treating their deaths as unfortunate incidents that happened somewhere far away. If you've made it this far in understanding what happened at this meeting and why it matters, you're part of an informed group of people who see through the propaganda and the spin to recognize what's really going on. And that awareness is crucial because democracy depends on citizens who pay attention, who think critically, who don't just accept whatever they're told by leaders who claim to have all the answers, and who hold those leaders accountable when they betray the values and interests they're supposed to defend. This is one of those moments in history that people will look back on and ask how it was allowed to happen, how an American president was able to so blatantly side with an authoritarian aggressor against a Democratic ally, how the warning signs were there for everyone to see, but somehow the situation continued anyway. And the answer to those future questions depends on what people do right now, whether they stay informed, whether they speak up, whether they demand better, whether they support the institutions and leaders who are trying to defend democratic values, even when America's own president has abandoned that role. The Ukrainian people will continue fighting for their freedom, regardless of what Trump says or does, because they understand that survival and liberty are worth fighting for, and they've proven their courage and determination over and over again. But they shouldn't have to fight alone, and they shouldn't have to face betrayal from those who claim to be their friends. And the fact that they're experiencing both right now is a stain on America's reputation and a betrayal of everything America is supposed to stand for in the world. As you think about everything you've learned here today, about Trump praising Putin while disrespecting Zelensky, about Russian propaganda becoming American policy talking points, about allies being abandoned while adversaries are appeased, about weakness masquerading as strength, and about betrayal dressed up as diplomacy, remember that you have the power to recognize the truth and to share it with others. Because in times like these, when leadership fails, it falls to ordinary citizens to be the guardians of the values and principles that make democracy worth defending. So stay informed, stay engaged, keep asking questions, keep demanding accountability, and never forget that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, especially when those in power seem more interested in serving authoritarian dictators than in serving the people they're supposed to represent and the values they're supposed to defend.